Hi, everyone. I just thought I would take a few minutes to record for you an example presentation. In this video, I am going to present to you an interesting article about conflict, but also kind of give some side notes and some tips that you can think about as you are creating your presentations. Just kind of wanted to warn you that the video is modeling an example presentation, but also has the extra tips. So if you see that this recording is a little bit longer than your presentation is, that's fine, right? Because mine is going to have a little bit extra information in it. Okay. But as you can see here, I'm going to be sharing with you a research study that was published by Samp and Bates in a 2011 Communication Studies journal article. The article is entitled Examining the Effects of Planning and Empathic Accuracy on Communication in Relational and Non-Relational Conflict Interactions. The title is kind of a mouthful. A lot of times the titles of these research articles are a lot to unpack. But hopefully the next couple of slides here help you better understand exactly what these researchers were interested in investigating and then ultimately what they found out. So my first two slides are going to include both a rationale for what the researchers are studying. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background information, and then the next slide will actually present the hypotheses. Of course, that's a good format that you'll want to follow as well. The rationale is ultimately, in a lot of ways, a summary of the literature review that's included in a research article. It kind of builds the argument for why this particular research study is important. And then the rationale or the review almost always ends with the hypotheses or the research questions, right? The idea being that if it's a really well-written rationale, a really well-written literature review, the authors have done a really good job of building this argument, leading you to be thinking, yes, we have to answer these particular questions or test these specific hypotheses. So in this particular argument, I would boil down the rationale for why this upcoming study that I'm going to describe to you is important is really summarized in two main ideas. The first is the notion that conflict, of course, is inherently a communication behavior, right? And we've talked about that throughout the semester. Digging a little deeper here, the other key idea is that goals are a common source of communication behavior. Interestingly enough, a lot of research has been done that looks at the goals involved in other types of communication behavior, like how do our goals influence our ability to be persuasive, or how are our goals related to our behavior when we're engaging in public speaking. But these authors make the case that actually we don't know very much about how our goals influence the way we interact in a conflict. So that's a really brief rationale, but in a nutshell, that's why this study was proposed. They're trying to figure out how setting goals and planning for those goals in advance can actually influence what happens during a conflict interaction. Now, in addition to that brief summary as to building the rationale for the article, I also want to point out to you that this article did a great job of not just making hunches about how our goals are related to our conflict behaviors, but they actually utilized a theory and some theoretical principles to help guide the creation of their hypotheses. I'm confident that the authors of your research studies also did the same thing. Right, as we've discussed in the class, and certainly probably something you've talked about in research methods courses, is that scientific study is not just based on our hunches or our guts or being those naive scientists, right? Scientific studies are theory driven. So this particular study utilizes a theory called goals, plans, action. Looks like my little face there is covering up the author's name. Dillard is given credit for this theory. But goals, plans, action theory basically suggests that all of our communication behaviors are goal-driven. More specifically, this theory says that goals lead to plans and plans lead to actions. And the theory kind of describes this process of creating, establishing goals, and using them then to make plans and to engage in actions. So if we break it down a little bit, what's important is to define each step. We know goals are our desired outcomes. Maybe your goal is to get the raise. Maybe your goal is to get the date that you're asking out, a potential romantic partner for. So goals are the desired end states, but our plans are the strategies or the tactics we intend to use in order to accomplish our goals. So your plan might include what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, what channel of communication you're going to use to communicate, when you're going to communicate, and so on and so on, right? So plans are the tactics or the strategies to accomplish the goals. And then actions are the actual behaviors that are carried out, right? The implementation of the plans. And let's face it, we know sometimes our actions do actually go according to plan, and we know sometimes they don't, right? And then we have to make contingency plans or use different actions or what have you. But in brief, right, that's the theory that's really guiding the hypotheses that these theorists came up with, which in turn are being tested in this article. So at this point, hopefully you have a little bit of better idea of what this article is going to be about. But now let's look really specifically at the hypotheses that are included. When you are describing your hypotheses to your classmates, you have a couple of options, right? You can cut and paste the hypothesis directly from the article onto your slide, or you can paraphrase it. Either strategy you use when you are actually discussing the hypotheses or the research questions with us, I do want to make sure that you were able to explain them in your own words. And I know that sometimes the hypotheses in research articles can be very wordy and quite verbose and complicated. So I know that it might be a difficult task, but if you can't really understand or explain to us what's being tested in the research article, then your audience won't be able to understand it as well. Right? So regardless of whether you cut and paste the words to your slide or you paraphrase the words, when you're actually presenting and describing to us, make sure you can in fact use your own words, not just the researcher's words. Okay. So in this particular case, we start with H1, and the authors predict that planning prior to an interaction, or excuse me, planning prior to a conflict will increase the chances of resolving a conflict. I think at face value, this is not a surprising prediction and kind of makes sense. Right? They're suggesting that if you sit down and you make a plan and you think about how you want the conflict to go, you are going to be more likely to reach a conflict resolution. So, for example, if I am anticipating having a conflict with my roommate regarding division of labor and maybe how the chores should be taken care of, the person who sits down prior to that conversation and kind of thinks through, this is what I'm going to say, and this is what the other person might say, and then this is what I might say in response. This prediction is suggesting that the person who does that is going to be more likely to reach conflict resolution than the person that does not. And again, I think initially that makes sense to me. Okay, hopefully that kind of seems like that makes sense to you as well. H2 predicts that individuals will be more likely to resolve non-relational problem-solving issues than relational conflicts. And so let me take a quick time out to explain the words that they're using there. Basically, this hypothesis is predicting that it's easier to solve non-relational problems. So they're saying it's easier to solve conflicts that are about things that are like separate from the relationship. So maybe you and your partner are having a debate about whether Taco Bell or McDonald's is better, right? That would be a non-relational type of thing. Maybe you guys are debating about something that you saw on TV, or what movie is best, or maybe you're having a conflict about some kind of assignment. You're in a class together and you don't agree on when the assignment is due or what some of the assignment criteria are. Those are all non-relational types of tasks. On the other hand, relational conflicts, are some things that we have discussed in class regarding, a reoccurring or a serial argument that you and a close interpersonal partner may have, right? So maybe you are having a conflict about whether or not you should move in together, or about whether or not it's time for you to meet your romantic partner's parents, or something like that. Okay, so again, H2 is predicting that the non-relational stuff will be easier to solve than the relational stuff. Again, I think at face value that isn't shocking to me, that seems like that might likely to be supported. All right, we've got two more hypotheses. H3 predicts that individuals who plan prior to an interaction will perceive themselves and perceive their partners as being more empathically accurate. Right? So when we're talking about this, we're really kind of talking about this idea of empathy and perspective taking. And so this prediction is saying if you are planning, making a plan prior to a conflict, you are more likely to think of yourself as being empathetic to the other person. You're more likely to assume that you are have taken the other person's perspective and done so in a way that's hopefully somewhat accurate. And then you're also more likely to assume the other person has done the same for you, right? That they are uh, more empathetic and more likely to engage in perspective taking. Okay? To me, really, this is just kind of arguing that planning leads to some level of reflection and ability to step out of our own shoes and look at an issue from another side, and those types of things, which again, at face value, makes sense to me and seems like something that should be supported. Our final hypothesis predicts that perceived empathically accuracy will be associated with resolving the conflict. Right? So if you feel like that you are able to be empathetic and you are engaging in this perspective taking and you perceive the other person to be doing the same thing, that should be kind of correlated with conflict resolution versus if that is not happening and you lack empathy and you think your partner is lacking empathy, that's going to be correlated with not resolving the conflict. Okay. All right, so again, by the time you're finished explaining the hypotheses to your classmates, first and foremost, of course, you want to make sure that they are clear and that you feel like your classmates will understand what predictions are being tested, even if they haven't actually read your journal article. And then, of course, associated with that, you want to kind of make sure that the rationale behind these hypotheses is also clear, right? Why the research the research authors would be making the predictions that they're making. All right, now that we've accomplished those things, the next step, of course, is the methods. So the methods section is always the section that describes how are the hypotheses getting tested, or how are the research questions getting answered. Any good methods section should include participants and procedures. Participants, who is involved in the sample? Procedures, what are they being asked to do? So definitely make sure that you've included that in your presentation and that the explanation of that is clear to your classmates. It may take one slide, it may take a couple slides to articulate. Here I've just kind of introduced you briefly to the participants and the procedure. I do have a couple follow-up slides to help articulate a little bit more about exactly what the procedure is. But as far as the participants are concerned, this study simply used college students. The sample included 82 dating couples, so technically 164 people total, but 82 dyads, and the participants ranged in age from 18 to 32. All of your articles that use human subjects are going to have gone through an IRB process, which means an ethics board is going to have approved them. All of your articles that involve human subjects are going to involve the participants signing their consent forms. Okay, so that type of stuff you really don't need to spend time addressing because that's a given for any research article involving people. Instead, focus on who's involved, what are some of the relevant demographics, how many participants are included. That's the important information that you want to focus on. Procedure, again, describes what did they do, right? What do the participants have to do? In this case, I've created this little graphic. I just displayed it so that you can see here, out of the 82 different dyads, the researchers put them into essentially 4 different groups that were manipulated based on 2 different variables. Briefly, I'll explain the variables, but my next slide will do that in a little bit more detail as well. But right now, I just want you to see that one big difference between the groups was you were either in a planning group and you were given time prior to a conflict interaction to discuss or to plan, to think about what you were going to say, or you were in the no planning group. You can see in my little chart there, I've tried to just divide that by the left-hand column and the right-hand column. And then the other way the groups were manipulated was you either got to talk about the task conflict first or the relationship conflict first, or vice versa. The researchers felt it was important to switch the order of those to ensure that it wasn't just that like the conflict you talked about first got handled in a certain way versus conflict that always got talked about second, maybe being handled a certain way. Okay, but let me advance the slide to talk about those things a little bit more detail. Right. So in this particular study, the planning variable was manipulated, like I said, right? If you were in the condition that was told you got to do some time to plan, then this was kind of the direction that you received, right? That the planning group was told, before you start the conversation, give us some insight into what you're planning to say and what you hope to accomplish. So in your particular presentation, I want to make sure that you identify for us what are the relevant variables being studied, how are they being operationalized, how are they being measured, and or how are they being manipulated, right? Like in this case, planning is being manipulated because either one group is being allowed to plan or one group is not being allowed to plan. Planning, we've discussed. Discussion type, I already mentioned, right? Again, groups were told the groups got to actually have two conversations. So this wasn't an either or situation. Each dyad had two conflict discussions, but the groups were or not either. The groups got two discussions. When they discussed their relational issue, they were asked to come up with a list of 5 of kind of recent conflicts or conversations that they've had. They did that independently, but then they came back together and the researcher helped them work through that and then narrow it down to one particular relational conflict that they could discuss for this study. And then for the non-relational issue, all of the dyads were given this negotiation task. It was really just like a hypothetical scenario that was kind of a role play, similar to some of the things that we do in class. Okay, so hopefully that helps explain for you how they set up the particular study. Once the dyads engaged in their conversations, either they got a plan in advance or they didn't, and then they discussed their task problem solving and their relational problem solving. They talked about one first and then the other, or vice versa. But once all of that was done, after that was done, then the researchers wrapped up the study by asking the participants to fill out 2 additional measures, and these were their outcome variables or their dependent variables. Well, the first one was pretty simple, but very important, and that was the researchers had to figure out whether or not the participants at least perceived that the conflict got resolved. So to assess that, they simply asked the participants to respond to the following statement. The participants read, "I consider the issue to be resolved," and then on a scale of 1 to 5, they either agreed or disagreed with that statement. Okay. I've included the mean scores there for you. You can go ahead and already look at those. You can see that for the non-relational conflict task, that kind of hypothetical scenario that everybody participated in, the average participant said 3.99 on a scale of 1 to 5 for conflict resolution. So for the most part, these dyads were kind of agreeing that this particular conflict was resolved. The second one there for the relational conflict, again, it was a scale of 1 to 5 where they responded to that statement. I consider the issue to be resolved. In this case, the average was 2.91. So at the very least, what I'm seeing here is that the participants were less likely to agree that the relational conflict got resolved than the non-relational conflict. And we'll circle back to that, right? Because that certainly is related to one of the hypotheses that the researchers were trying to test. The second outcome variable that was measured had to do with the empathy, right? And how accurate participants thought they were and their partners were at their empathy. And for this particular variable, the participants, again, simply responded to a couple of statements on a 1 to 5 scale, so whether they agreed or disagreed. For self-accuracy, like I think I was able to accurately empathize with my partner, they respond to the statement, I feel like I really understood my partner's perspective. And then below, you can see the partner's accuracy. I feel like my partner was able to see my side of the issue. For this one, I displayed the mean scores in a chart here for you. I just wanted to show you this. This chart wasn't in the article itself. I created it just using a simple Excel spreadsheet. But I just wanted to show you that this is something that you could do potentially with your results as a nice way to visually share data with your classmates. By looking at this real quickly, one of the things that I notice is that the orange bars that represent empathic accuracy are taller than the blue bars. So to me, what that's kind of suggesting is people think they're more able or more accurate at being empathetic to their partner than they think their partner is being empathetic to them. Right? I don't know. I mean, probably we can kind of see that even if it was just presented at like mean scores, like I did with the conflict resolution variable. But I also just think visually is definitely makes it really easy to see. So I encourage you, even if your research article doesn't necessarily provide a chart or a table to visually show data, you can take it upon yourself, right, to potentially create a graphic that you think might be useful here for your classmates. All right, so at this point, we hopefully have a pretty good understanding of what happened in this study, right? Basically, you and your romantic partner were told to talk about two different conflicts, one being relationally important to you, one being a non-relational task. You and your partner either got a chance to plan or you didn't get a chance to plan. Then you talked about the issues. And then after that, you were asked, did the conflict get resolved? And you were asked about whether or not you felt like you were able to be empathetic or not. That's what happened in a nutshell. So what did they find? All right, when you're presenting your results to your classmates, you can restate the hypotheses. Again, you could cut and paste directly from your article or paraphrase. Regardless of the words you put on your slide, make sure that you can talk about it in your own words, right? Because ultimately what we're doing now is kind of presenting the takeaway message, right? So you really want to make sure your classmates really understand what did they actually find. So if you'll recall, this study had 4 hypotheses that we need to work through. The first hypothesis predicted that planning prior to a conflict would increase the chance of resolving the conflict. Interestingly enough, this was not supported. I didn't provide the statistics that were included in the study. It's kind of up to you. If you want to include the statistics on your slide, you can. If you understand them and can talk about them, great. But this is not a research methods class, and I know that some of you may or may not have kind of some statistics background. So if you don't include them, that's okay. But you will need to make sure to still interpret the results for us. Right. So in this case, I don't have the stats, but I am telling you that they actually found planning was not likely to increase the odds of resolution. And even though this kind of feels counterintuitive, once the researchers kind of found this outcome, they were able to kind of think through it. I kind of thought through it a little bit more, and can offer a few explanations about maybe why they found this outcome. And to me, I think probably the best explanation is that idea of plan fixation that I've got listed there. So personally, I know that when I have a conflict, and if I try to plan, kind of how I'm going to manage it before the conflict, I can sometimes then be guilty or fall into the trap of fixating on what my plan is supposed to be. So again, like personally, I know I'm kind of one of those people that has that conversation in her head over and over again. And so I know that sometimes I do that, and then I get in the real life conversation, and the conversation doesn't necessarily match what I predicted in my head. But I still sometimes like fixate on that like conversation I had on my head, right? And then when the real life thing is that meeting my expectations, that actually in itself creates some more stress and some more conflict and all of that. So maybe that is some kind of explanation for why this first hypothesis was not supported. Okay. In addition to that, another possibility might be the fact that, at least for the relational conflict issues, many of those issues were probably serial arguments. They were probably topics that the couple had over and over and discussed over and over again. So it's possible that regardless of whether the couple planned or did not plan in advance, it would be unlikely for these conflicts to get resolved in this kind of 10-minute lab conversation. On the flip side, it's possible that some of the problem or non-relational issues that the couple worked through actually maybe were not perceived as all that big a deal. I mean, I don't know. Again, I compared this particular conflict to some of the ones like we do in class, these hypothetical scenarios. And it's possible that the couples, worked through those and just like maybe you do in class, you think, well, that's interesting, but like I don't really care if it gets resolved or not. It's not like a real life thing. So maybe that's why there was just a lack of motivation to work through those, and that's why it led to less resolution, regardless of whether the couple planned or did not plan in advance. H2 predicted that individuals would be more likely to resolve non-relational problem-solving tasks than relational conflicts. This one was supported. And, it was supported for some of the reasons I laid out earlier when I was discussing the rationale. So as I mentioned earlier, maybe some of those public issues are in fact a little bit easier to resolve. It's easier to work through a disagreement about an assignment criteria, right? It's easier to work through a conflict about, which the better restaurant is, McDonald's or Taco Bell. It's much harder to work through some of those relational issues. In part, the second bullet point there lays out, because some of those relational issues might simply at this point be perceived as simply unable to be resolved, right? And so again, maybe a 10-minute conversation is just not going to be able to help you resolve those issues. H3, if you recall, predicted that individuals who plan prior to interaction will perceive themselves and their partners as more empathically accurate. This hypothesis was not supported. Okay. Again, I can offer up a couple explanations. Part of the explanation might be due to a lack of motivation. As I mentioned previously, the problem task, people may just not have been that interested in it, right? Not that big of a deal. I'm not trying that hard to figure out the other person's perspective because it's just this kind of hypothetical task that I don't really care that much about. On the flip side, for the relational issues, particularly if those were serial arguments the couple had several times before, again, there might be a lack of motivation. I have tried to figure out what this person's perspective is. I have tried to understand their point of view, but at this point, I'm kind of over it. So I'm not really going to try that hard now. So in either case, it's possible that it's not so much that people were not able to be empathetic, but they just didn't try that hard at it. And that might explain why the third hypothesis wasn't supported. Finally, H4. H4 predicted that perceived empathic accuracy is positively associated with resolving the conflict. And this hypothesis was, in fact, supported, right? Ultimately, this boils down to some stuff we've discussed in class. When you feel validated, when you feel like someone's trying to understand your point of view, that leads to good things. Right? And I mentioned this before, but now's a good time to reiterate. Feeling understood is not the same thing as agreement. So trying to understand someone's side does not mean that you have to feel the same way or agree with that side, but just this act of trying to be empathetic, trying to take another person's perspective, and feeling like someone is trying to understand you does appear to be a really good thing, right? To help with conflict resolution. Okay. All right, so ideally, the last part of your presentation will wrap things up for us and really help your audience walk away with a couple of key takeaway ideas. Right? So for this particular article, the first thing I think is really important is to point out that relational conflicts can, in fact, be harder to resolve than non-relational conflicts. Right? Intuitively, we probably already thought that might be the case, but now we have some empirical evidence to support that. At some level in the real world, what that tells me is we got to cut ourselves a little bit of slack, knowing that these relational conflicts, these conflicts over those trip goals, things like the identity stuff and the relational stuff, are just simply really hard to manage, right, and to resolve. Secondly, another key message here is just to reiterate that feeling understood, feeling like you understand your partner and that your partner's trying to understand you is really important in conflict resolution. And that can really go a long way to helping manage conflicts. And then, interestingly enough, the last takeaway I want to leave you with is about planning. And planning isn't necessarily the automatic end-all be-all that we maybe thought it might be going into reading this article, right? Planning just does not inherently lead to conflict resolution. Rather, certain ways of making a plan might actually be better than others. Certain ways of making a plan might actually be problematic for resolving a conflict. So those are kind of 3 takeaways, I think, that you can leave with you after hearing about this article, even if maybe you forget some of the other nuances or details. Okay. All right, at the end here, I do have a citation for the article. If you want to look into that, you could now find that on your own. But we're right now at the 30-minute mark, which again, I know is longer than your presentations will be, but hopefully at some level, this video helps you kind of see an example of a presentation as well as hear some tips and suggestions I have for you as you are working on your presentation. The last thing I'll remind you of is that your presentation does not need to be a video, so there's no need to record or submit that in advance, but instead you'll just simply upload your PowerPoint presentations to Canvas, and then your presentation will be synchronous, and you'll be able to share it live with your classmates during our session, and they'll be able to ask you some questions then after you present. As always, if you have any other questions or concerns about the assignment, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks.